year was 1878, and the small town of Amherst in Nova Scotia sat shrouded in a heavy fog that seemed to seep from the very ground itself. Inside a modest 2-story cottage on Princess Street, the air grew unnaturally cold as the sun dipped below the horizon, leaving the residents in a state of growing unease. This was not merely the chill of a Canadian autumn approaching, but a spectral frost that penetrated walls and skin, alike signaling the arrival of something ancient and malevolent. The Teed family gathered around their hearth, seeking warmth that the fire struggled to provide, while shadows danced wildly in the corners of the room, suggesting unseen observers were present. Silence in the house was heavy and oppressive, like a physical weight pressing down on the chest of anyone foolish enough to enter. It was here, in this unassuming dwelling, that a series of events would unfold that would baffle scientists and terrify the faithful for generations to come. At the center of this gathering storm was a young woman named Esther Cox, who lived in the overcrowded cottage with her sister Olive Teed and her brother-in-law Daniel Teed. Esther was 18 years old and described by neighbors as a vibrant and somewhat emotional young woman with low, set blue eyes and a head of short, curly hair. The house was small for the number of people living inside, which included the 2 sisters, their husbands, and young children, creating an environment that was cramped and devoid of privacy. The tension in the household was palpable even before the supernatural events began, as the financial strains of the late 19th century weighed heavily on Daniel Teed, who worked as a shoemaker in a local factory. The physical proximity of so many bodies in such a small space created a charged atmosphere that many paranormal researchers later speculated acted as a battery for the entities that were about to manifest. The catalyst for the nightmare occurred on a damp evening in late August, when Esther Cox experienced a traumatic encounter that would fracture her psyche and arguably open a doorway to the other side. She had gone for a carriage ride with a male acquaintance named Bob McNeil, who was known around town for his rough demeanor and questionable reputation. During the ride into the dark woods surrounding Amherst, the man attempted to assault Esther, forcing her to flee into the rain-soaked night to escape his advances. She returned to the cottage on Princess Street hours later, disheveled and hysterical, weeping uncontrollably as she collapsed into the arms of her sister Olive. The emotional shock of the event was severe, causing Esther to fall into a state of deep melancholy and distress that lasted for days. It was during this period of extreme vulnerability that the atmosphere in the Teed cottage began to shift from merely cramped to distinctly hostile. Several nights after the incident in the woods, the first true manifestation of the haunting began in the bedroom that Esther shared with her sister Jenny. As the two young women lay in the darkness, trying to sleep, they were startled by a strange, rustling sound coming from beneath their bed. It sounded like a large animal moving through dry straw, scratching and clawing at the floorboards directly under the mattress. Esther whispered to Jenny, asking if she heard the noise, and the two sisters sat up in bed, their hearts pounding in the silent room. They lit a kerosene lamp to investigate, expecting to find a rat or a stray cat that had wandered inside from the cold. However, when they looked under the bed, the space was empty, and the noise ceased immediately, only to resume the moment the light was extinguished. This game of cat and mouse continued until dawn, leaving the sisters exhausted and terrified. The activity escalated dramatically the following night, when the invisible entity decided to make its presence known through physical contact. Esther Cox had just climbed into bed when she screamed in sudden pain and pointed to a box of patchwork quilt pieces that had been placed under the bed earlier that day. To the horror of Jenny, the box suddenly flew out from under the bed frame and launched itself into the air, hovering momentarily before crashing to the floor. Before the girls could process this impossibility, the bedclothes were violently ripped from their bodies by unseen hands, flying across the room and landing in a heap in the corner. Jenny tried to pull the sheets back over her trembling sister, but the invisible force was too strong and yanked them away again with a violence that suggested a conscious and angry intelligence was at work. The sisters fled the room, screaming for Daniel Teed to help them. Daniel Teed was a pragmatic man who had little patience for ghost stories or hysterical women. But the commotion in the girls' bedroom forced him to intervene. He rushed into the room, armed with a lamp, and found Esther sitting on the edge of the bed pail and shaking uncontrollably while the bedclothes lay scattered across the floor. Assuming the girls were playing a prank or suffering from nightmares, he scolded them and replaced the blankets, tucking them in firmly. However, the moment Daniel turned his back, the sheets and heavy wool blankets leaped into the air as if thrown by a powerful man and landed near the door. Daniel stood frozen in disbelief, watching the impossible physics of the event unfolding before his eyes. He checked the windows and doors for drafts or strings, but found nothing that could explain the violent energy that now permeated the room. The terror reached a new level of physical manifestation a few nights later, when Esther began to complain that she was swelling up and felt like she was going to burst. Her skin became hot to the touch, and her entire body turned a bright crimson red, causing her to writhe in agony on the bed. Olive and Jenny watched in horror as Esther appeared to expand unnaturally, her clothes stretching tight against her skin, as if she were being inflated from within. Panic set in, and Daniel ran to fetch the local physician, Dr. Carrot, hoping for a medical explanation for the bizarre symptoms. By the time the doctor arrived, Esther was in a trance-like state. Her eyes rolled back in her head, and her breathing shallow and ragged. The family stood around the bed, praying for relief, while the house itself seemed to hold its breath in anticipation of what would happen next. Dr. Carrot was a man of science and arrived at the Teed cottage fully expecting to diagnose a case of hysteria or a fever-induced hallucination. He examined Esther and noted her rapid pulse and the strange swelling of her body, but he could find no physical cause for the affliction. As he stood by her bedside, observing the patient, the pillow beneath Esther's head suddenly began to move on its own accord. It slid out from under her neck and smoothed itself out as if unseen hands were preparing it for a guest before sliding back into place. The doctor stared in stunned silence, rubbing his eyes to ensure he was not suffering from a lack of sleep. He sat on the edge of the bed to hold the pillow down, but the force beneath it was so strong that it nearly bucked him off, proving to the skepticism of the man of science that physical laws were being violated. As the doctor continued his observation, a series of loud, explosive knocks began to echo from beneath the bed, sounding like someone striking the floorboards with a heavy sledgehammer. The sounds were deafening and caused the entire cottage to vibrate, shaking pictures on the walls and rattling the china in the kitchen cupboard. Dr. Carrot looked under the bed and saw nothing but bare floorboards. Yet the sounds continued with a rhythmic intensity that seemed to mock his confusion. He walked outside to the street to see if someone was pounding on the exterior of the house. But the night was silent, and the street was empty. The source of the noise was undeniably located within the room, centered directly around the suffering form of Esther Cox. The doctor returned inside, pale and shaken, admitting to Daniel Teed that this was beyond his medical expertise. Word of the strange events at the Teed cottage spread quickly through the small town of Amherst, and soon neighbors were gathering outside, hoping to catch a glimpse of the supernatural. The house became a spectacle, with people pressing their faces against the windows and whispering about the devil being loose in Nova Scotia. Inside, the torment continued unabated, with the entity growing bolder and more aggressive with each passing night. One evening, while several witnesses were present, the sound of scratching on the wall became so loud that it drowned out the conversation in the room. Everyone turned to look at the wall above Esther's bed, where the plaster began to flake away, as if an invisible knife were carving into the surface. Slowly and deliberately, letters began to form in the plaster, revealing a message that would chill the blood of everyone present. The invisible hand carved deep, jagged letters into the wall, spelling out a terrifying declaration of intent that left no room for interpretation. words, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill," appeared in large crude letters etched into the plaster by a force of immense power. The gasps of the witnesses filled the room as the reality of the threat sank. In confirming that this was not a mindless energy, but a sentient predator with a specific target, Esther stared at the writing on the wall, her eyes wide with terror, realizing that the entity was not just haunting the house, but was hunting her specifically. The message remained on the wall for days, a grim reminder of the danger that lurked in the unseen realm, and a warning that the worst was yet to come for the young woman. The haunting soon escalated from noises and movement to the dangerous element of fire, bringing a lethal dimension to the phenomena. Small fires began to erupt spontaneously throughout the house, starting in places where no ignition source existed. A rug in the hallway would suddenly burst into flames, or a curtain would ignite while everyone was on the other side of the room. The family lived in constant fear of being burned alive in their beds, and kept buckets of water in every room to combat the sudden infernos. On one occasion, a dress that Esther was wearing began to smoke and smolder, forcing her to tear it off before it consumed her. The smell of burning fabric and sulfur became a permanent scent in the Teed cottage, adding a sensory layer to the horror that permeated their daily lives. Desperate for help and fearing for the safety of his family, Daniel Teed reached out to the local clergy, hoping that a spiritual intervention might succeed where medicine had failed. Several ministers from different denominations visited the cottage to pray and perform rites of exorcism, but their efforts seemed only to anger the entity further. During one prayer session, a large family Bible was picked up by an invisible hand and thrown across the room, hitting a wall with a thunderous crash. The holy men left the house shaken and defeated, advising the family that the evil present was too strong for them to combat alone. The failure of the church to protect Esther deepened the despair of the family, who felt abandoned by both science and religion in their battle against the darkness. It was during this time of crisis that a man named Walter Hubbell arrived in Amherst, bringing with him a mix of curiosity and opportunism. Hubbell was an actor and a self-proclaimed expert on the paranormal who had heard rumors of the Amherst haunting and traveled to Nova Scotia to investigate. He approached Daniel Teed and asked to board with the family, offering to pay rent in exchange for the opportunity to witness the phenomena firsthand. Daniel was initially reluctant to invite a stranger into their chaos, but the family needed the money, and Hubbell seemed genuinely interested in helping. Hubbell moved into the cottage and began keeping a detailed diary of the events, recording every knock, every fire, and every attack on Esther with the precision of a court stenographer. Walter Hubbell did not have to wait long to see the evidence he sought. as the entity seemed eager to perform for a fresh audience. On his first night in the house, his personal belongings were scattered around his room, and his heavy boots were thrown at the door by unseen hands. Hubbell watched in fascination as a glass of water levitated from the bedside table and floated through the air before tilting and pouring its contents onto the floor. He noted that the objects did not move randomly, but with intelligence and purpose, often reacting to things he said or did. He attempted to communicate with the spirit using a system of knocks, asking questions, and receiving intelligent responses that confirmed the presence of multiple distinct personalities within the haunting. The most aggressive of the spirits identified itself as Bob, referencing the man who had assaulted Esther in the woods, suggesting a psychic connection to her trauma. Another spirit claimed to be Maggie, a more mischievous and less violent entity that seemed to enjoy playing pranks on the family. Hubbell documented conversations where the spirits would answer questions about the neighbors or reveal secrets that Esther could not possibly have known. The entity displayed a terrifying omniscience, knowing what was happening in other parts of the town and taunting the family with this knowledge. Hubbell became convinced that Esther was the victim of a powerful demonic possession or poltergeist infestation that fed off her vital energy. The physical attacks on Esther became increasingly brutal, often leaving visible marks and bruises on her body. Pins from her sewing kit would materialize in the air and stab into her skin, causing her to cry out in pain, while blood trickled down her arms. Hubbell witnessed these attacks and recorded them in his journal, describing the way the pins seemed to be guided by a malicious intelligence. On one occasion, Esther was slapped across the face by an invisible hand, leaving red finger marks on her cheek that slowly turned to bruises. The violence was relentless, wearing down Esther's physical and mental resistance until she was a shadow of her former self. The family watched helplessly as their loved one was tortured day and night by an enemy they could not touch. The fires intensified, putting the entire neighborhood at risk and drawing the attention of the local authorities. The police were called to the Teed cottage numerous times to investigate the mysterious blazes, but they could find no evidence of arson. However, the suspicion of the town began to turn against Esther, with many believing that she was setting the fires herself in a fit of madness or for attention. The idea of a ghost setting fires was too fantastic for the pragmatic legal system and pressure mounted to arrest Esther for endangering the public. The family tried to explain the supernatural nature of the events, but their pleas fell on deaf ears as fear and skepticism hardened the hearts of the community. The situation reached a breaking point when a fire broke out in the barn behind the cottage, threatening to ignite the surrounding buildings. The fire brigade managed to extinguish the flames, but the patience of the town had run out, Esther Cox was arrested and charged with arson, a crime that carried a severe penalty in the late 19th century. She was taken to the local jail and locked in a cold, damp cell, separated from her family and the support system she desperately needed. The tragedy of her situation was compounded by the fact that the haunting did not stop simply because she was behind bars. The jailers reported strange noises and movements in her cell, proving to the few who would listen that the demon was attached to Esther and not the house. While in jail, Esther's health deteriorated rapidly as the stress of imprisonment and the continued psychic attacks took their toll. She spent her days huddled in the corner of her cell, terrified of the shadows and the invisible hands that continued to torment her. The guards became uneasy hearing knocks on the metal bars and watching objects slide across the floor without explanation. After several months, it became clear that keeping Esther in jail was solving nothing, and the authorities eventually released her into the custody of her family. She returned to the cottage on Princess Street, broken and stigmatized, labeled as the girl who was haunted by the devil. Upon her return, the activity resumed with a vengeance, as if the entity was angry at her absence. Furniture was overturned, windows were shattered, and the writing on the wall reappeared with new threats. Walter Hubbell, who had stayed with the family throughout the ordeal, decided that the only way to save Esther was to take her away from Amherst. He proposed a tour where Esther would tell her story to the public, hoping to raise money for her treatment and perhaps find a specialist who could help. The family agreed out of desperation, and Esther and Hubbell embarked on a short-lived speaking tour through the maritime provinces. However, the plan backfired spectacularly. The tour was a disaster from the start, as the entity seemed determined to sabotage any attempt Esther made to profit from her misery or seek help. During a performance in a local theater, the lights suddenly went out, and a storm of loud knocks drowned out Hubbell's voice. The audience panicked, fearing that the devil was in the room with them, and fled the theater in a chaotic stampede. The reputation of the Great Amherst Mystery preceded them, and soon venue owners refused to book them, fearing riots or supernatural damage to their property. Defeated and humiliated, Esther and Hubbell returned to Amherst, realizing that there was no escape from the shadow that clung to her. In a final attempt to rid the house of the evil, Daniel Teed sought the help of a local Micmac medicine man who was rumored to have power over spirits. The indigenous healer arrived at the cottage and performed a cleansing ritual using burning herbs and chanting ancient prayers intended to drive out the malevolent energy. For a brief period, the activity seemed to subside, and the house felt lighter than it had in months. The family allowed themselves to hope that the nightmare was finally over and that they could return to a normal life. Esther began to smile again, and the color returned to her cheeks as she enjoyed the respite from the constant terror. The peace was short-lived, however, as the entity returned with a fury that surpassed all previous manifestations. It seemed that the attempt to banish it had only made it stronger and more vindictive. The poltergeist began to target the children of the household, tossing their toys across the room and pulling their hair while they slept. Daniel Teed realized that he could no longer risk the safety of his own children for the sake of his sister-in-law. With a heavy heart, he told Esther that she had to leave the cottage for the good of the family. It was a devastating blow for Esther, who had nowhere else to go and felt abandoned by the only people who had stood by her. Esther moved into the home of another local family, the Van Ambergs, who took pity on her and offered her a room. The haunting followed her to the new location, proving once and for all that the attachment was personal. At the Van Amberg house, the phenomena changed in character, becoming less violent but more psychological. Esther reported hearing voices whispering in her ear, telling her to do terrible things to herself and others. She struggled to maintain her sanity as the voices chipped away at her reality, blurring the line between the living and the dead. The town of Amherst watched from a distance, a mixture of pity and fear directed at the cursed girl. One particularly harrowing incident at the Van Amberg house involved a large, heavy dining table flipping over completely while the family was seated for dinner. The food and china crashed to the floor, and the women screamed as the table spun on its side like a spinning top. The display of raw kinetic energy was terrifying and served as a reminder that the entity was still powerful and dangerous. Esther fled the room in tears, humiliated and terrified that she would be kicked out of yet another home. She felt like a pariah, a carrier of a contagion that destroyed everything she touched. After nearly a year of continuous haunting, the activity began to slowly fade in intensity. The violent attacks became less frequent, the fires stopped, and the writing on the wall ceased to appear. It was not a sudden end, but a gradual withdrawal, as if the entity was losing interest or had drained enough energy from its victim. Esther was left exhausted and scarred, but alive, having survived an ordeal that would have killed a weaker person. She eventually moved to the United States, hoping to leave her past behind and start a new life where no one knew her name or the dark history she carried. Esther Cox married twice and had children, trying to build a normal existence in the aftermath of the horror. She rarely spoke of the events in Amherst, preferring to keep the memories locked away in the dark corners of her mind. However, those who knew her said that she remained jumpy and anxious for the rest of her life, always listening for the sound of a knock or the smell of smoke. The trauma of the Great Amherst Mystery had left a permanent imprint on her soul a scar that no amount of time or distance could fully heal. She died in 1912, taking the secrets of her experience to the grave. Walter Hubbell published his book, The Great Amherst Mystery, in 1879, detailing his experiences and observations in the Teed cottage. The book became a sensation and remains one of the most detailed accounts of poltergeist activity ever written. Hubbell remained convinced until his death that what he witnessed was genuine proof of the supernatural, and that Esther Cox was a victim of forces beyond human comprehension. His detailed records provided a unique insight into the dynamics of the haunting, preserving the story for future generations of researchers and enthusiasts. The Teed cottage on Princess Street stood for many years as a local landmark, a silent witness to the terror that had unfolded within its walls. Locals would walk past quickly on the other side of the street, afraid to look at the windows where the writing had appeared. The house was eventually demolished, but the legend remained ingrained in the folklore of Nova Scotia. Stories were told around campfires and in hushed tones in living rooms, keeping the memory of Esther Cox and her invisible tormentor alive. The site where the cottage stood is now just an ordinary patch of land. But some say the ground still feels cold, even on the hottest summer days. Skeptics have offered many theories over the years to explain the events, ranging from elaborate hoaxes to undiagnosed mental illness. Some suggested that Esther possessed telekinetic abilities that she could not control, triggered by the trauma of the assault in the woods. Others believed that she faked the phenomena to get attention or to escape the drudgery of her life as a poor relation in a crowded house. However, none of these theories can fully explain the multiple independent witnesses, the physical injuries, or the knowledge the entity possessed. The sheer duration and intensity of the haunting argue against a simple hoax carried out by a young girl. Modern parapsychologists view the Amherst case as a classic example of recurrent spontaneous psychokinesis, or RSPK. This theory suggests that the energy comes from the living agent, usually a repressed or traumatized adolescent, rather than a discarnate spirit. The repressed emotions of anger and fear are externalized as kinetic energy, causing objects to move and fires to start. If this theory is correct, then Esther Cox was not haunted by a demon, but by her own demons manifested in the physical world. It changes the narrative from one of possession to one of tragic psychological projection. Regardless of the cause, the suffering of Esther Cox was undeniable and real. She was a victim of circumstances beyond her control, caught in a whirlwind of supernatural violence that destroyed her youth. The Great Amherst Mystery serves as a reminder of the fragility of reality and the thin veil that separates our world from the unknown. It challenges our understanding of what is possible and forces us to confront the uncomfortable truth that there are things in the dark that science cannot explain. The story remains as chilling today as it was in 1878, a testament to the enduring power of the unknown. The legacy of the haunting extends beyond the borders of Nova Scotia, influencing ghost stories and horror fiction for over a century. The image of the writing on the wall and the fires that start from nothing have become tropes in the genre, echoing the real-life horror of the Teed cottage. It serves as a dark chapter in Canadian history, a moment when the impossible invaded the mundane life of a small town. The mystery remains unsolved, a puzzle with missing pieces that can never be recovered, leaving us to wonder what really happened in that cold, damp house. As we look back on the events of 1878, we are left with a sense of lingering dread and unanswered questions. Was it a demon, a ghost, or the shattered mind of a young woman crying out for help? The answer lies buried with Esther Cox and the witnesses who have long since passed into the shadows. All that remains is the story, a cautionary tale about the darkness that can dwell within ordinary homes and ordinary people. The Great Amherst Mystery stands as a monument to the unexplainable, a ghost story that refuses to die. The final thought that lingers is the realization that we may never be truly safe in our own homes. If invisible forces can invade a cottage in Nova Scotia and terrorize a family for a year, then the walls we build offer no protection against the supernatural. The story of Esther Cox is not just a historical curiosity, but a warning that the boundary between the living and the dead is permeable. We walk through life assuming we are alone in our rooms, but the Amherst Mystery suggests that we are always being watched by eyes we cannot see. In the end, the silence of the Teed cottage was restored, but the echo of the knocks still resonates in the history of the paranormal. The ground where the house stood may be empty now, but the energy of the events has left a stain on the fabric of time. Visitors to Amherst still ask about the girl and the ghost, seeking a connection to the mystery that put the town on the map. The story has become immortal, a permanent resident in the landscape of fear, ensuring that Esther Cox will never be forgotten. So tonight, as you lay in the safety of your own bed, listen closely to the sounds of your house settling. Is that just the wind rattling the window? Or is it the scratch of a fingernail on the glass? Is the creak in the floorboard just old wood? Or is it the footstep of something that has been waiting for you to turn out the light? The Great Amherst Mystery teaches us that the dark is not empty, and that sometimes the things that go bump in the night are real. Sleep well, and pray that the writing never appears on your wall. Ultimately, the story of Esther Cox is a tragedy of a life interrupted by the unexplained. She was a normal girl, who became the epicenter of a hurricane of horror. And her name is now synonymous with one of the most aggressive hauntings in history. We remember her not for who she was, but for what happened to her, a victim of a cosmic accident or a demonic design. Her story is a testament to the endurance of the human spirit in the face of overwhelming terror. As the fog rolls in off the Atlantic and covers the streets of Amherst, once more we can almost hear the faint echo of a girl screaming in the night. The mystery endures, resisting all attempts to debunk or explain it away, standing defiant against the light of reason. It is a story that belongs to the dark, to the cold nights, and the flickering candlelight. It is the Great Amherst Mystery, and it is waiting for you to believe.